I'm going to use the AdventureWorks LT 2012 sample database that Microsoft makes available on CodePlex. The database consists of 10 tables with data about customers, products, and orders, as well as 2 support tables, build version and error log. It's by no means a comprehensive enterprise-level database, but it has enough complexity to let you explore most of Entity Framework's most important and commonly used features. And to keep things uncluttered, I'm going to refer to the sample database just as the AdventureWorks LT database. Now, just as one note, as of now, Microsoft has released some specialized data samples for SQL Server 2014, which is the version of SQL Server I'm using in this course. But so far, it hasn't released any 2014 versions of the traditional AdventureWorks databases. But the good news is that the 2012 versions work just fine with 2014. Now I'm going to build the Entity Framework project here as a class library, making it easy to use and reuse the entity objects in multiple applications. This is certainly not necessary. You can create and use Entity Framework objects in the same application in which you'll use them if you're sure that you'll never need to reuse them in other applications. But this way, you can see what is required to use an Entity Framework class library in other applications. And here I'm going to use a simple console application. Not all sample applications in this course use separate class library and user interface applications, though. I don't expect that you'll need to reuse entity objects that access the sample AdventureWorks LT database very often. Now, in most of this course, the sample applications will be simple console application. That's because the focus here is on the Entity Framework itself, and less so on using entity objects in web, desktop, and other kinds of applications, each of which has rich binding support between all data objects and user interface controls. The details of configuring those bindings can easily obscure the details of the Entity Framework itself. All right, so let's take a look at actually using the Entity Framework. In this exercise, I'm going to create a class library with an entity data model that maps some of the tables in the AdventureWorks LT database and creates entity objects that you can use in an application to access the data within the database. All right, so I have Visual Studio here started. I have all the Entity Framework prerequisites installed. So I'll come up here and select File, New Project. And I'm going to select a class library. So under Windows Desktop, Class Library. I can put it in a convenient location. And I'm going to call this the AdventureWorks Library. Click on OK. And as usual, Visual Studio creates the project and the folders and so forth, and opens up this class file. I don't want this particular class file, so I'm going to come over here to Solution Explorer and get rid of it. And now it's time to actually add the entity data model to the project. So I'll come up here to the name of the project in Solution Explorer, select Add, New Item, and I'll select the Data tab here, and the ADO.NET Entity Data Model. Now this is something that I'm likely to reference in code, so I want to give it a meaningful name. So I'm going to name this the AWLT model. I don't want the name to be too long because I need to type it out in code sometimes, even with IntelliSense, but it's going to use the AdventureWorks LT database, so that identifies it. And then a naming convention that I like to use is to include model as the suffix to identify exactly what this is. All right, I'll click on Add. And that fires off the Entity Data Model wizard. Now the option I'm going to select, because I want to use database first here, I want to reverse engineer the database and pull in objects into my model, I'm going to use the EF Designer, Entity Framework Designer, from database, because I have an existing database. And you can see the description down here creates a model in the Entity Framework Designer based on an existing database. You can then choose the database connections, settings for the model, and objects to include. And then it's going to generate classes that your application can interact with that Entity Framework is going to generate from the selections you make. Now another option is the empty EF Designer model here, and that's where I want to start from scratch. I want to build the model first and then create the database from it, which is called Model First Development. There's another option called Code First Development, And so there's a couple of options there. I can create an empty code first model or code first from database. So these are just different approaches for creating different kinds of models. The end result is generally the same. Well, code first is kind of a special situation, but it really depends on if you have an existing database or not and the particular methodology that you want to use. And so again, I'm going to reverse engineer from an existing database, the AdventureWorks LT database, and create a model from the objects that are already within that database. All right, I'll click on Next. And now we need to have a connection to the database. So if I had any existing connections within the project or within this instance of Visual Studio, those would appear. I don't, so I need to create a new connection. So I'll click on that button there. I'm going to use Microsoft SQL Server as my data source. And click there to open up the Connection Properties dialog box. In this case, I'm going to use the local server. So I'm going to use the local name. I could also use the machine name if I wanted to. I could also use an instance of SQL Server installed on a remote machine, and I just type in the name. In this case, I'm going to use Windows Authentication. That works for me. I'm working as a system admin on this machine. But if I needed to use SQL Server Authentication, I could select that option and add the username and password. And then I can go ahead and select the database. And that's a nice little step of authentication or confirmation that I have the authentication set up correctly because I got the list of databases. I want to use AdventureWorks LT 2012. I can test the connection. That succeeded. And click on OK in order to create the connection. And then if I needed to, if I had any special circumstances, if the database was configured in particular ways, I can come here to this advanced box. But for most cases, you won't need those kinds of specialized options in your connection string. All right, so I'll click on OK. And that now creates this AdventureWorks LT 2012 data connection. All right, so notice that down here it has this option to save the connection settings in app.config. This is a little bit misleading because that's not all this does. What this does is it's going to save the connection settings in the config file as it says, but this is also the name of the object that you're going to use in code in order to give you the top-level access into the entity data model. So I'm going to change this to something a little bit less unwieldy and just change it to AWLT entities. And then this middle part here shows the connection string that Entity Framework requires. I'm not going to talk a lot about this yet, but there are 3 different models that are used within Entity Framework, and these provide the names and the locations of where those different models are going to be located within the assembly, or actually within the output of the compilation process, the build process. The important part at this point is that I have this connection string right here, data source equal, and this should look fairly familiar if you've worked with various kinds of connection strings within .NET applications. And it identifies the location of the data, local in this case, the initial catalog, the database it's going to use is the AdventureWorks LT 2012, integrated security, I used Windows Authentication, so that's true, and then a couple other settings. So that's the real connection that the .NET application needs. And then the first part up here is some additional information that the Entity Framework needs in order to use this database connection. All right, so I'll move on by clicking Next. And now I have this option of which version of Entity Framework I want to use. In this case, I want to use the latest version, and so I'll click on Next. And at this point, Entity Framework, or the wizard, goes out to the database and gets a list of all of the available objects that are usable within the entity data model. Depending on the complexity of the database, that step can take a fair amount of time. AdventureWorks LT is not real complex, and so it just took a few moments to get. But this is where you select the objects, the database objects, that you want to include in the model. And you have complete control of this. You want to include one table? Include one table. If you want to include 1,000 tables, go for it. All right, and so I can go down here and expand the list of tables. You can see that they're separated by schema names. And you can see all of the different tables that are available within that database. And the same for the views, as well as stored procedures. All right, so in this case, what I want to do is I want to select all the tables, but I don't actually want these DBO tables. So I could either select tables up here and then deselect that, or I can just go right here and select the Sales LT schema, and that automatically selects all of the tables within that schema. These are just a couple of support tables. They're not something that you would actually use within an application. Not normally anyway, but you could include them if you wanted to. And be aware that there could be an additional table here called sysdiagrams, and that's available if you, in Management Studio, you've gone in and created a database diagram. I haven't within this particular database, and so that additional system table doesn't appear there. All right, and then the same way, I'm going to select all of the stored procedures, and then come down here and scroll down or drill down into the DBO, because I want all the stored procedures, but I actually don't want two of them. I don't want this, and I don't want print error. Those are just kind of a couple support stored procedures. These are actually user-defined functions that provide information about the data in the database. And I want to use those behaviors within my application, so I need to include them within the model. Okay, once again, it has the model namespace down here. I'm going to make this a little bit shorter as I have the other times, because I need to reference this within my application. So the model namespace is AWLT model. All right, at that point, that's all the changes that I want to make, so I'll click on Finish. And it'll go out now, look at the selections I made, and generate a model from all of those selections. All right, I get the security warning. This is, well, it looks a little bit scary, but it's really not all that bad. What it says is running this text template can potentially harm your computer. Do not run it if you obtained it from an untrusted source. Basically what's going on here is that it's using the T4 code generation feature that's built within Visual Studio in order to generate the model, as well as a lot of code. And so because this is installed from the internet, it says, oh, well, you know, is this really trustworthy? Well, in this case, yes, it's trustworthy. Downloaded from Microsoft. It's part of Visual Studio, so go ahead. And we get it one more time because it uses a couple different templates. And after a few moments, we finally get the model. All right, first thing to look at is Solution Explorer. And I'll collapse the references here. But as you can see, it added a number of files to Solution Explorer. And then the other thing it did is it opened up the designer here. I'm going to hide that window right there. And as you can see, I now have a number of entities within the designer that mirror the objects in the database that I selected. So this is a graphic view of that entity data model. All right, so going back over to Solution Explorer, just some of the highlights here is the main file is this awltmodel.edmx. This is actually an XML file that contains all the mapping information and the metadata for the model. So this is the file that the wizard opens within the entity data model designer here in Visual Studio. Okay? And then there's also an awltmodel.designer.cs file here. This contains code that implements the entity objects. And there's actually a number of files that implement that, including this context file. And then the individual objects are implemented within these individual code modules here. It also added an app.config file here. If I double click on that to open it, you can see that it added the connection string right there called AWLT entities. That's what I named within the wizard. And then there's that connection string that I talked about. It has the metadata that Entity Framework needs. If you scroll to the right, it then has the regular ADO.NET connection string for making the physical connection to the database. And then one other thing to point out is that in this case, if I come up to references, I have the references to Entity Framework and an Entity Framework.SQL Server. So if I right click on this and look at properties, you can see that this is using version 6.0.0.0. Well, wait a second. That's the version that was shipped with Visual Studio. Right, because in this project, I haven't yet updated it to the latest version. And furthermore, I can look at Solution Explorer here and look at the packages.config and see that Entity Framework version 6.1.0 is also available as a package, but that's an older version as well. So what I want to do is come down here to Package Manager Console, and I want to install, actually I want to update package. Hit the Tab key, Entity Framework, and hit Enter. And it'll go out. Look at the version that's currently installed. It's modified. Oh, I have a file open, so that's okay. No problem there. All right, and then as you can see, it's adding Entity Framework 6.1.1, downloading it, successfully installed, and then it's attempting to uninstall 6.1.0, but it's not able to completely do that because essentially I have a reference to it within this project, and so I need to restart Visual Studio. So I'm not going to do that right now, but that's the process of now updating the project to use the latest version of Entity Framework. So you're pretty much, anytime you create a new project, you're going to want to take this step in order to use that latest version.